My mother called me a parasite while she threw my $3,000 designer luggage onto the wet grass of a house that I pay for. She told me my sister and her kids were moving in, and I was no longer welcome because my life was too easy and I did not understand the meaning of family. She thought she was taking my home, but she did not realize she was actually cutting her own lifeline. When I walked away without a word, she laughed and told me to enjoy the cold, but by the next morning she had called me 70 times in a panic. You are going to want to hear exactly how this parasite decided to stop feeding the host. I am Charmaine, 35 years old, and somehow I am still healing from wounds my family inflicted. I am a successful software developer who spent the last decade building a fortress of financial security to protect myself from the very people who were supposed to love me. I escaped their toxicity years ago, but I made the mistake of maintaining occasional contact because a small part of me still craved the motherly love I never received. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I pulled my car into the long, winding driveway of our sprawling colonial home in Fairfield, Connecticut. To anyone looking from the street, the house was a dream of white columns and perfectly manicured lawns. To me, it was a monument to my own hard work. I had been working 14-hour days for months as a lead developer on a major fintech project, and I was exhausted. All I wanted was to take off my heels and disappear into my sanctuary of a bedroom. But as I rounded the final curve of the driveway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There in the middle of the lawn, scattered like trash, were my Toomey suitcases and my limited edition leather bags. My clothes were spilling out onto the grass and my professional gear was piled haphazardly near the sprinkler head. I stepped out of the car and the silence of the neighborhood felt heavy. Before I could even process the sight, the front door creaked open. My mother Elaine stepped out onto the porch. She was 58 years old and always dressed like she was headed to a country club brunch, even when she was committing an act of war. She stood there with her arms crossed, looking down at me with a smirk that told me she had been waiting for this moment all day. Behind her, the screen door pushed open again. My sister Keisha stepped out, clutching a glass of wine. Keisha is 34 and has spent her entire life perfecting the art of being a victim. She had her 2 children trailing behind her, and standing in the shadows of the foyer was her husband, DeAndre. DeAndre is 35 and has never held a job for more than 3 months, but he always has an opinion on how other people should spend their money. I looked from the bags to my mother, and my voice was remarkably calm. I asked her, "What is going on here? Why is my stuff on the lawn?" Elaine did not even flinch. She said, "Your sister is moving in with her 2 kids today. They have been struggling in that cramped apartment for too long, and this house has too much empty space. Keisha needs the stability and the support. You, on the other hand, are a parasite. You have been living here for free, taking up a room that a family with children actually needs. It is time for you to leave and find your own way." I felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my chest, but I choked it back. I looked at the house, then back at her. I reminded her that I was the one who paid off the back taxes when she was about to lose this place. I reminded her that I pay the landscaping bill, the utilities, the grocery tab, and the property insurance. I am not a guest here. I am the reason this roof is still over her head. Keisha stepped forward then, and her voice was dripping with false sympathy. "Oh, Charmaine, don't be so dramatic. You make so much money with your little computer codes. You can afford a penthouse in the city. You don't need this big house. I have kids to think about. Why are you being so selfish? Family is supposed to help each other, and all you ever do is brag about your success while we suffer." DeAndre chimed in from the doorway with a smug grin. "Yeah, listen to your mom. We are the ones doing the real work of raising the next generation. You are just an ice queen living in a bubble. Go find a hotel or something. We need to get the kids settled into your room." I looked at my mother and asked if she was joking. I asked if she really expected me to just walk away after everything I had done for her. Elaine laughed then, and the sound was like glass breaking. She said, "I am completely serious. You have always been the difficult one. You think because you have money you can control us, but this is my house. I gave birth to you, and I am telling you to get off my property. You are lucky we even let you keep those fancy bags. Now pick up your trash and go." I stood there for a long moment. I could feel the heat of the Fairfield sun on my neck and the sting of the betrayal in my throat. Growing up in this house meant privilege to outsiders, But inside these walls, emotional coldness permeated every corner. My childhood bedroom had been my sanctuary and my prison, but I realized in that moment that I had been paying for a seat at a table where I was never truly welcome. I looked at Keisha, who was already gesturing to the kids to start bringing their toys inside. I looked at DeAndre, who was looking at my car with envy, and finally I looked at my mother. I said nothing. I did not scream. I did not beg. I did not point out the legal reality of the situation just yet. I simply turned around and started loading my luggage into the trunk of my car. My movements were slow and deliberate. I could hear them whispering on the porch. I heard my mother say, "See, she knows she is wrong." I heard Keisha giggle. Before I continue this story and tell you exactly what I did once I got into that car, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth and tried to use your success against you. Trust me, the payoff for this one is a lesson they will never forget. As I clicked the trunk shut, I realized they really thought they had won. They thought that because they were family, I would just roll over and keep the money flowing while they enjoyed the fruits of my labor. They saw me as a bank account with a pulse. They didn't realize that a software developer knows exactly how to shut down a system when it becomes corrupted. I got into the driver's seat and gripped the leather steering wheel. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the three of them standing there like a royal family overlooking their new kingdom. My mother was pointing at my garden and telling Keisha where they would put the new swing set. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway. I didn't look back. I drove straight to a luxury hotel 10 miles away. I checked into a suite that cost more per night than Keisha's monthly rent used to be. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my laptop. I am a financial risk analyst by trade and a developer by passion. My brain works in logic and numbers. The logic was simple. The host had decided to reject the entity that was keeping it alive. If I was a parasite, then it was time to see how the host survived without its blood supply. First, I logged into my banking portal. I revoked the authorized user status on the 3 credit cards my mother carried in her wallet. Those cards paid for her hair appointments, her high-end groceries, and her wine club memberships. Within seconds, those plastic strips became worthless pieces of garbage. Next, I opened my smart home app. That beautiful colonial home was equipped with the latest technology, all of which was registered to my personal account and paid for through my private server. I looked at the thermostat settings. It was a humid 90 degrees in Connecticut. I set the air conditioning to 85 degrees and locked the control panel. Then I navigated to the utility company websites. The accounts for electricity, water, and gas were all in my name. I had set them up that way years ago to ensure the bills were never late. I clicked the button to request a final reading and a total service disconnection effective the following morning. I wasn't done. I emailed my lawyer. The property was held in a trust that I had created to protect my mother from her own bad financial decisions after my father passed. But the fine print of that trust was very specific. I was the primary trustee and the sole financier. The house was mine in every way that mattered. I looked at my phone. It was silent. They were probably inside right now celebrating their victory and ordering takeout on my dime. They had no idea that the walls were about to start closing in. I ordered a bottle of champagne to my room and sat by the window watching the sun set over the city. I thought about all the years I had tried to buy their love. I thought about the straight as I maintained the honor societies I joined and the prestigious career I built just hoping for a single word of genuine pride from Elaine. All I ever got was a demand for more. Tomorrow morning, they were going to wake up in a house that was rapidly heating up with no water to wash their faces and no way to buy breakfast. They were going to find out that the ice queen they despised was the only thing keeping them from the heat of the real world. By the time I finished my first glass of champagne, the first notification popped up on my screen. It was a text from my mother. It said, "The air conditioner seems to be broken. Come back and fix it right now." I didn't reply. I put my phone on Do Not Disturb and went to sleep on the softest pillows I had ever felt. I knew that when I woke up, the real drama would begin. They wanted me out and I was gone. Now they just had to figure out how to live without me. I woke up the next morning feeling more rested than I had in years. The heavy weight of obligation that usually sat on my chest was gone, replaced by the crisp air conditioning of my luxury suite. I stretched against the soft sheets and picked up my phone from the nightstand. The screen was a chaotic battlefield of notifications. 112 text messages, 43 missed calls. Most of them were from my mother, but a few were from Keisha and DeAndre. I ignored all of them and ordered a smoked salmon Benedict with a pot of French press coffee from room service. While I waited for my breakfast, I opened the smart home application on my tablet to check the status of my former residence. The temperature inside the Fairfield house had reached 88 degrees. The humidity was climbing and the interior cameras showed a scene of absolute misery. I tapped into the kitchen feed just in time to see Keisha stomping around in her pajamas. She looked exhausted, and her hair was sticking up in every direction. She was aggressively opening and slamming cabinet doors, looking for my imported Italian espresso machine. I could not help but smile. When I packed my car yesterday, I made sure to take the things that brought me joy, and that included the $2,000 coffee maker I had bought myself for my last birthday. Keisha slammed the last cabinet shut and yelled for our mother. Elaine walked into the kitchen, fanning herself with a magazine. She looked disheveled. The polished country club facade from yesterday was melting under the oppressive heat of the house. Keisha pointed at the empty counter space and demanded to know where the coffee machine was. She complained that she had barely slept because her kids were crying about the heat, and now she could not even get a decent cup of coffee. She also whined that the guest room bed felt like sleeping on sandpaper because I had packed all my Egyptian cotton sheets. Elaine tried to maintain her authority. She told Keisha to calm down and just make instant coffee. She confidently stated that I was just throwing a tantrum and that I would be back by the weekend begging for forgiveness. She said I was trying to punish them, but it would not work because family always sticks together. I watched my mother pour herself a glass of tap water, not realizing that the water pressure was already dropping as the utility company processed my shut-off request. Her delusion was almost fascinating to witness. She truly believed that my need for her approval was stronger than my self-respect. Watching them in that kitchen brought a bitter taste to my mouth that had nothing to do with the morning air. It took me back to a day I had tried very hard to forget. It was the day of my father's funeral 5 years ago. That was the day I finally understood my permanent role in this family. When my father died, the entire house fell into chaos. My mother locked herself in her bedroom, refusing to deal with anything. Keisha, who was 29 at the time, completely fell apart. She claimed her grief was too overwhelming to function, so I stepped up. I was 25 years old, working an entry-level analyst job and barely sleeping, but I took control. I paid for the casket out of my meager savings. I arranged the church service. I picked out the flowers. I coordinated the repast and made sure everyone had food to eat. On the day of the funeral, I stood at the back of the church, making sure the logistics ran smoothly. I did not shed a single tear in public because someone had to be strong. Someone had to hold the pieces together. During the reception in the church basement, I watched my mother hold court. Keisha sat next to her, weeping loudly into a tissue while my mother stroked her hair. I walked over to hand my mother a plate of food. She took it without looking at me, and then turned to her friends. She pointed at Keisha and said, "Look at my poor sweet girl. She has such a tender heart. She is completely broken by this loss." Then she gestured vaguely in my direction and said, "Charmaine is handling the paperwork. She has always been the cold one. She does not feel things the way we do." I stood there holding a stack of funeral programs, feeling completely invisible. I had emptied my bank account and exhausted my body to give my father a dignified farewell, and my mother viewed my strength as a defect. Keisha's loud performative grief earned her endless comfort and sympathy, while my silent heavy lifting earned me the title of the cold one. That was the dynamic. Keisha was the fragile glass doll that needed constant protection, and I was the workhorse expected to pull the cart without ever asking for a drink of water. A knock on my hotel room door pulled me out of the memory. Room service had arrived. The waiter wheeled in a cart covered in silver cloches and poured my coffee with a warm smile. I tipped him generously and sat down at the small dining table, opening my laptop next to my plate. The food was delicious, but the real feast was playing out on my security camera feed. DeAndre finally stumbled into the kitchen. He was wearing an undershirt that was soaked in sweat. He looked angry and immediately started complaining about the temperature. He demanded to know why the air conditioning was not working. Elaine told him I must have messed with the settings before I left, but assured him she would call an HVAC technician later to have it fixed. I took a bite of my smoked salmon and laughed out loud. An HVAC technician was not going to touch that system without a massive upfront payment, especially once they saw the name on the property deed did not match the woman asking for the repair. DeAndre ignored her explanation and opened the refrigerator. He stared at the shelves and then slammed the door in frustration. He complained that there was no real food in the house, just ingredients. He told Keisha he was not going to eat cereal for breakfast and told her to order a massive spread from the upscale diner downtown. He wanted steak and eggs, pancakes, and freshly squeezed juice for the kids. Keisha looked at my mother and asked for her credit card. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I leaned closer to the screen. Elaine sighed, acting like she was making a grand sacrifice, but pulled her wallet out of her purse. She handed Keisha the sleek black credit card that was tied directly to my primary account. It was the card I had given her for emergencies that she routinely used for luxury purchases. Keisha took the card and opened the food delivery app on her phone. She spent 10 minutes selecting the most expensive items on the menu. She added extra bacon, extra syrup, and specialty smoothies for her children. I watched her thumb tap the checkout button. I knew exactly what was happening on the server side of that application. The app sent the authorization request to the bank. The bank checked the status of the card. The system recognized the block I had placed on all authorized users last night. Keisha frowned and tapped the screen again. She muttered that the app was glitching. She deleted her security code and re-entered it. She tapped the button a third time. DeAndre asked her what was taking so long because he was starving. Keisha looked up at my mother with a confused expression. She said the card was declining. She said it was saying payment method invalid. Elaine snatched the phone out of Keisha's hand. She stared at the red error message on the screen. She said that is impossible. My credit limit on that card is $15,000. The irony was entirely lost on her. It was not her credit limit. It was my credit limit. She immediately picked up her own phone and dialed the number on the back of the card. She put the phone on speaker so I could hear the automated voice from the bank perfectly through my kitchen camera. The robotic voice thanked her for calling and asked for her account number. Elaine typed it in aggressively. After a brief pause, the voice returned. We are sorry, but this card has been reported lost or stolen by the primary account holder and has been deactivated. Please contact the primary account holder for further assistance. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Elaine stood frozen, staring at her phone as if it had just bitten her. Keisha looked terrified. DeAndre crossed his arms and glared at his mother-in-law. He asked her what the automated voice meant by primary account holder. He asked her if she was not the one paying the bills. Elaine stammered. She tried to deflect. She said there must be a mistake at the bank. She said she would go down to the branch later and sort it out. But the panic in her eyes was unmistakable. The illusion she had maintained for 3 years was beginning to crack. She had convinced DeAndre and Keisha that she was the matriarch providing for her flock. She had hidden the fact that she was entirely dependent on the daughter she had just thrown out like trash. DeAndre was not stupid when it came to other people's money. He realized very quickly that the gravy train had just derailed. He yelled at Keisha, asking her how they were supposed to feed their kids if her mother was broke. Keisha started crying immediately, playing her favorite role of the helpless victim. She wailed that the house was too hot, and now they had no food and it was all my fault. I sat back in my chair and took a slow sip of my coffee. The flavor was rich and perfectly bold. They had wanted me out of the house because I was taking up space. They had called me a parasite. But as the reality of their situation began to set in, it was becoming painfully clear who was actually feeding off whom. My phone vibrated on the table. It was another text from Elaine. This one was not demanding or angry, it was just one sentence. Please call me right now. The bank made a mistake with my card. I deleted the message without replying. I was not going to fix this. I was going to let the pressure build. The air conditioning was off, the cards were dead, and in a few hours the water would stop flowing. The quiet exit was over. The siege had officially begun, and I had all the time in the world. By 3 in the afternoon, the temperature inside the house had reached a suffocating 91 degrees. I sat in my air-conditioned hotel suite, watching the camera feeds with a detached fascination. The Fairfield house was built with thick insulation designed to keep the brutal Connecticut winters at bay. But in the middle of a summer heatwave, with the smart thermostat firmly locked, that same insulation turned the house into a brick oven. DeAndre was the first to hit his breaking point. He marched down the hallway wearing nothing but basketball shorts, carrying a towel over his shoulder. He announced to the sweltering living room that he was taking a cold shower and that nobody better use the water while he was in there. I smiled and toggled over to the utility management portal on my laptop. The water company had sent me an email 30 minutes prior confirming the final meter reading. I watched the hallway camera as DeAndre disappeared into the guest bathroom. Less than 2 minutes later, a roar of absolute fury echoed through the house. The bathroom door flew open and DeAndre stumbled out. He was covered in a thick layer of body wash, but there was no water left to rinse it off. He had soap in his eyes and he was blindly wiping at his face with the dry towel, cursing loudly. Keisha jumped up from the leather sofa where she had been fanning herself. She ran to the kitchen and shoved the faucet handle up. A pathetic sputtering sound filled the room, followed by a few drops of rust-colored water before the line went completely dead. The water was officially off. Elaine rushed into the kitchen, her face flushed red from the heat and the mounting stress. DeAndre stood in the hallway glaring at her with soapy water dripping onto the hardwood floor. He yelled at her, asking what kind of a house she was running. He demanded to know why the water was turned off. Elaine looked like a cornered animal. She grabbed her cell phone and dialed the local water authority. She put the phone on speaker again, completely forgetting, or perhaps not caring, that DeAndre and Keisha were listening to every word. A customer service representative answered, and Elaine immediately launched into a tirade demanding that they turn the water back on at her residence. The representative asked for the account details. After a brief pause, the woman on the phone politely informed Elaine that the account had been closed by the primary account holder, Charmaine, and that the final bill had already been paid. Elaine tried to use her authoritative country club voice. She said, "I am the homeowner, and I demand that you open a new account in my name immediately." The representative agreed and began processing the request. I leaned in closer to the screen, taking a sip of my iced water. This was the moment Elaine's house of cards was going to completely collapse. The representative came back on the line, and her tone was distinctly less accommodating. She informed my mother that based on her social security number and her current credit score, a security deposit of $450 would be required to establish new service, along with a connection fee of $75. Elaine scoffed and told the woman to just put it on her credit card. She rattled off the numbers of the card I had deactivated that morning. The representative typed it in and then said, "I am sorry, ma'am, but this card is declining as invalid. Do you have another form of payment?" Elaine froze. DeAndre stepped into the kitchen, his eyes narrowed. He looked at his mother-in-law and asked her point-blank if she had any money. Elaine stammered, claiming she had cash in her purse, but she needed to go to the bank. DeAndre laughed a harsh, cruel sound. He said, "You do not have a bank account, do you? You have been living off Charmaine this whole time." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Keisha looked at our mother with a mixture of horror and disgust. Keisha had spent her entire life believing the narrative that Elaine was the wealthy matriarch, and I was just the lucky daughter who was allowed to live in her basement. Finding out that the roles were entirely reversed broke the illusion she had clung to for 34 years. Keisha started to cry. It was not her usual manipulative crying meant to gain sympathy. It was the genuine panic of a woman who realized she had just alienated the only person who could keep a roof over her head. She turned on our mother and screamed, "How could you do this? You told us we could live here. You told us Charmaine was just a guest. Now my kids cannot even get a glass of water. Elaine tried to defend herself, but her words were weak. She said, I gave birth to her, she owes me. I let her live here when she needed a place to stay. DeAndre wiped the soap from his neck with the towel and threw it on the counter. He told Elaine she was delusional. He said, Charmaine owns this house, does she not? You are the guest. We just kicked out the landlord. As the sun began to set, the temperature in the house finally stopped rising, but the heat remained trapped inside. The house was bathed in the orange glow of twilight when the final blow was delivered. At exactly 6 o'clock, the electric company processed my disconnection order. The hum of the refrigerator died. The digital clock on the microwave went blank. The central air conditioning unit outside spun to a complete halt. The Fairfield house was plunged into absolute darkness. The children immediately started screaming. The sudden darkness combined with the oppressive heat was too much for them. Keisha scrambled around in the dark, trying to find her phone to use the flashlight. I watched the night vision cameras kick on, painting the inside of the house in an eerie green glow. This was the reality of the golden child dynamic playing out in real time. My mother had spent decades sheltering Keisha from every consequence. When Keisha failed out of college, Elaine blamed the professors. When Keisha married a man with no ambition, Elaine said he just needed time to find his passion. Elaine had enabled Keisha into total helplessness while simultaneously punishing me for my independence. I was the black sheep because I did not need her to rescue me. I only needed her to love me, and since she could not control me, she decided to resent me instead. Now sitting in the dark with no water and no power, the golden child was completely useless. Keisha sat on the floor crying along with her kids, waiting for someone else to fix the problem. Elaine stood in the center of the living room, her hands covering her face, realizing that her entire identity was built on my money. DeAndre, however, was not crying. He was a survivor in the worst sense of the word. He operated on instinct, and his instinct was telling him that he needed cash immediately. He could not stay in a house with no power, and he knew his mother-in-law was useless. I watched on the camera as he turned his flashlight app on and began walking purposefully down the hallway toward my home office. My office was the only room in the house that I had locked before I left. I had installed a heavy-duty smart lock on the solid oak door. DeAndre jiggled the handle and found it secured. He shined his light on the keypad. I could see the wheels turning in his head. He believed that because I was a financial analyst, I must keep cash or valuables hidden in my workspace. He was desperate, and desperate people make terrible decisions. He walked back to the garage. He was moving quickly now, ignoring the complaints of his wife and the crying of his children. He returned to the hallway carrying a heavy steel crowbar. I sat up straight in my hotel bed, setting my coffee cup down. This was the escalation I had been waiting for. I pressed the record button on my viewing application, ensuring that the cloud backup was actively saving the footage. DeAndre wedged the crowbar between the doorframe and the heavy oak door of my office. He pushed with all his weight. Wood splintered and cracked loudly in the silent house. Elaine yelled from the living room, asking what he was doing. DeAndre told her to shut up and mind her business. He threw his shoulder into the door, and with a final, violent crunch, the lock gave way. He stepped into my sanctuary. He swept his flashlight across my custom shelves, my empty desk, and the spot where my server used to sit. Then his beam of light stopped on the floor of the closet. There, bolted to the floorboards, was a small, fireproof safe. DeAndre smiled. It was a greedy, desperate smile. He gripped the crowbar tightly and walked toward the safe. He had no idea that he was not just breaking into a box. He was breaking into a felony, and I was watching every single second of it in high definition. I picked up my phone and opened my contact list. I scrolled down until I found the number for my attorney. It was time to start drafting the legal paperwork. The siege was about to move from a war of attrition to a full-scale legal assault. The phone rang twice before Valerie answered. Valerie was a sharp, no-nonsense property attorney who had helped me set up the LLC 3 years ago. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told her to open her secure email because I had just sent her a live link to my home security system. I heard the clicking of her keyboard on the other end of the line. A few seconds later, Valerie let out a low whistle. She asked if that was my brother-in-law currently taking a crowbar to my fireproof safe. I confirmed that it was and asked her what the penalty was in Connecticut for destruction of property and felony breaking and entering. Valerie chuckled a dry and clinical sound. She said, given the value of the custom door he just destroyed and the contents of that room, he is looking at grand larceny and severe property damage. She asked if I wanted her to call the police right now. I told her no. I wanted to wait until he opened the safe. I wanted him to see exactly what he was stealing. I asked Valerie to draft an emergency order of protection and an illegal detainer for everyone currently inside the property. Valerie agreed and said she would have the paperwork ready for a judge to sign by first thing tomorrow morning. I hung up the phone and turned all my attention back to the monitor. DeAndre was sweating profusely in the 90-degree heat of my office. His muscles strained as he wedged the crowbar deeper into the seam of the safe. With a loud metallic snap, the hinges gave way. DeAndre dropped the crowbar and practically dove onto the floor. He ripped the heavy door open, expecting to find stacks of $100 bills or expensive jewelry. Instead, he found a neat stack of manila folders. I watched his face fall from greedy anticipation to absolute confusion. He pulled out the thickest folder and opened it. Even on the night vision camera, I could see the moment his eyes scanned the bold print at the top of the page. It was the original deed of trust and the transfer of ownership documents for the property. DeAndre was not an educated man, but he knew what a property deed looked like. He flipped through the pages frantically. He saw my signature. He saw the LLC name. He saw the zero balance on the mortgage. He threw the papers onto the floor in a rage. He had just risked prison time for a stack of legal documents that proved he was currently trespassing. He kicked the empty safe and stormed out of the office, leaving my private papers scattered across the hardwood floor. I switched the camera view back to the living room. The dynamic in the house had shifted from panic to primal desperation. The children were crying loudly now, complaining that their stomachs hurt. Keisha was rocking back and forth on the couch, using a piece of cardboard to fan herself. DeAndre marched into the room and kicked the coffee table. He pointed a finger directly at Elaine. He yelled that there was nothing in the safe but a bunch of legal papers. He told Elaine she was a liar and a fraud. He said Charmaine owns this entire property and you do not have a single dime to your name. Elaine shrank back against the armchair. The grand matriarch of the family was completely exposed. DeAndre demanded to know how they were going to eat. He told Elaine she needed to call one of her rich country club friends and borrow some cash right now to order food. Elaine shook her head frantically. She said she could not do that because she would be completely humiliated. She said her friends thought she was financially independent, and she could not let them know the truth. Her pride was literally starving her own grandchildren. Keisha stood up and screamed at our mother. She asked how Elaine could care more about her country club reputation than her own family. Keisha yelled that her kids needed to eat and that Elaine needed to fix this immediately. Elaine fired back, telling Keisha that if she and her deadbeat husband actually had jobs, they would not be begging for grocery money. The argument devolved into a vicious screaming match. All the toxic resentment they usually directed at me was now turned inward. They were tearing each other apart over a grocery bill. DeAndre yelled that he was not going to sit in a dark, hot house and starve. He told Keisha to get her purse because they were taking the kids and going to a motel. He said Elaine could sit in the dark by herself. This was exactly the moment I had anticipated. I opened the smart home application on my tablet again. While the main power to the house was disconnected, the security system and the electronic deadbolts operated on a high-capacity backup battery. The system was designed to last for 48 hours in the event of a total grid failure. I navigated to the perimeter control panel. I engaged the digital lockout protocol. I heard the heavy metallic click through the camera audio as the front door deadbolt locked from the inside. I did the same for the back patio door and disabled the electronic motor on the garage door. If they wanted to leave the house, they could absolutely walk out the front door by manually turning the lock. But the moment that door closed behind them, the exterior keypad would deactivate completely. Their digital keys were already wiped from the system. If they stepped foot outside, they were never getting back in. DeAndre grabbed his keys and stormed toward the front door. He turned the manual latch and yanked the door open. A wave of humid night air rolled into the house. He turned back and told Keisha to grab the kids and follow him. But Keisha hesitated. She looked out into the dark driveway and then back at the house. She asked him where exactly they were going to go. She reminded him that their bank account was overdrawn and all their credit cards were maxed out. She asked how they were going to pay for a motel when they could not even afford a pizza. DeAndre stopped in his tracks. The reality of their profound poverty hit him like a physical blow. Without my house to live in, and without my credit cards to swipe, they were entirely destitute. DeAndre slowly closed the front door. The heavy deadbolt engaged automatically with a loud beep, securing them inside once again. He slid down the wall and sat on the floor with his head in his hands. Elaine watched them from the armchair. She did not offer a word of comfort. She was too busy wallowing in her own misery. The family unit she had tried to build by excluding me had completely imploded in less than 24 hours. I sat in the quiet luxury of my hotel room watching the aftermath of the explosion. I felt no guilt. I felt no sadness. I only felt a deep and abiding clarity. For my entire life, I had been told that I was the problem. I had been told that my boundaries were selfish and that my success was a threat to the family cohesion. But the truth was, they did not have cohesion. They only had a shared parasitic reliance on my labor. I picked up my phone and called room service. I ordered a slice of chocolate cake and a glass of cold milk. I deserved a treat. Tomorrow morning I was going to meet Valerie at the courthouse to get the eviction papers signed by a judge. Then I was going to call the local police precinct and request a police escort to my property to serve those papers and report a felony burglary. I watched the night vision feed as my mother finally fell asleep in the armchair, her head resting awkwardly against the upholstery. Keisha and the kids were curled up on the leather sofa, sweating and exhausted. DeAndre was still sitting on the floor by the front door, staring blankly at the wall. The house that was supposed to be their grand prize had become their holding cell. When my cake arrived, I ate it slowly, savoring every bite. I thought about the first time Elaine called me a parasite. I thought about the sheer audacity of her entitlement. She had stood on my lawn and told me to leave my own home. She had smiled while she threw my belongings into the dirt. I wondered if she would still be smiling when the sheriff knocked on the door tomorrow morning. I closed my laptop and plugged my phone into the charger. I did not need to watch them anymore tonight. The trap was sprung and the doors were locked. They had nowhere to go and no resources to rely on. The digital eviction had perfectly transitioned into a psychological one. I pulled the heavy hotel comforter up to my chin and closed my eyes. Tomorrow was going to be a very busy day, and I needed to be well rested for the grand finale. I slept deeply, knowing that my days of being the family bank account were officially over and my new life was just beginning. As I drifted off to sleep, my mind wandered back to my teenage years. I remembered being 16 years old and working a part-time job at a local grocery store just to afford my own clothes. My mother never had money for my school supplies, but she always managed to find enough cash to buy Keisha designer jeans and expensive makeup. When I asked why things were so unequal, Elaine told me that Keisha needed the extra confidence boost while I was naturally resilient. That was her excuse for everything. My resilience was a weapon she used to deny me care. She weaponized my strength to justify her neglect. I remembered the night I got my acceptance letter to a prestigious university with a full academic scholarship. I ran into the kitchen to show my parents. My father had smiled and patted my shoulder, but my mother had barely looked up from her magazine. She told me it was a shame I had to go so far away, because Keisha was going to a local community college and needed my help with her homework. She made my greatest achievement about my sister's deficiencies. She could not allow me to have a single moment of unadulterated joy. All those years of emotional suppression had built the financial empire I now controlled. I had channeled every ounce of my frustration into my career. I learned how to analyze risk, how to build secure systems, and how to recognize a bad investment. And the worst investment I had ever made was trying to buy the love of a mother who only valued me for what I could provide. The morning light crept through the blackout curtains of my hotel room. I woke up at 6 o'clock sharp. I took a hot shower, relishing the strong water pressure and the expensive botanical shampoo. I dressed in a sharp tailored suit. It was the armor I wore to board meetings and high-stakes negotiations. Today I was negotiating the final terms of my liberation. I checked my phone. The battery backup on the home security system was still holding strong at 60%. The camera in the living room showed that nothing had changed. They were all exactly where I had left them. DeAndre was still on the floor, Keisha was on the couch, and Elaine was in the chair. They looked like prisoners of war waiting for a rescue that was never going to come. I grabbed my purse and my laptop bag. I walked out of the hotel room and headed down to the lobby to meet the driver I had arranged. It was time to go to the courthouse. It was time to make everything official. The slow burn was over. The inferno was about to begin. The black SUV was waiting for me outside the hotel lobby just as the sun began to bake the city pavement. As I settled into the plush leather seat and gave the driver the address to the county courthouse, I opened my laptop. Last night was about creating immediate physical discomfort with the utilities and the climate control. Today was about completely severing the financial arteries that kept their illusion of independence alive. Elaine and Keisha had lived in a protective bubble funded entirely by my labor, and it was time to systematically dismantle it. While the driver navigated the morning traffic, I initiated the next phase of the digital eviction. I logged into my cellular provider portal. I was the primary account holder of a premium family plan that included Elaine's phone, Keisha's phone, and even the device DeAndre used to browse social media all day. They used those phones to coordinate their petty family dramas and complain about me behind my back. I selected all 3 of their phone lines and clicked the button labeled Suspend Service immediately. I chose the option for lost or stolen devices just to ensure they could not easily port the phone numbers to a new carrier. Within seconds, their primary connection to the outside world was instantly vaporized. Next, I opened my auto insurance dashboard. The Lexus SUV sitting in the Fairfield driveway was registered in my mother's name, but the insurance premiums were deducted directly from my checking account every 6 months. DeAndre's oversized pickup truck was also bundled onto my policy because he claimed he could not afford the liability coverage. I canceled both policies with a few keystrokes. Driving those vehicles was now a legal liability. The financial heartbeat of their existence was rapidly flatlining, but I was not quite finished. I pulled out my phone and called my private wealth manager at the bank. Even though I had deactivated my mother's authorized user credit cards the night before, I suddenly remembered an old joint checking account we had opened when I was in college. Elaine still had a debit card linked to that account tucked away in her wallet for what she called absolute emergencies. I knew DeAndre would be tearing the house apart looking for any alternate source of funds. My banker answered immediately. I told him I needed to execute a total freeze on the legacy joint account. I instructed him to report the debit cards associated with that account as lost and stolen. I explained that I suspected fraudulent activity and wanted an immediate hold on any outgoing wire transfers or cash withdrawals. The banker processed the request in less than 2 minutes. He assured me that any attempt to swipe those cards would trigger an automatic fraud alert and a hard decline at the register. The final financial bridge was officially burned to ash. I switched over to my security camera application to observe the fallout. The Fairfield house was bathed in harsh morning sunlight, and the interior temperature was already climbing back into the high 80s. The living room looked like a disaster zone. The children were crying loudly on the floor, holding their stomachs. DeAndre was pacing back and forth in the kitchen, looking completely unhinged. Keisha was standing near the front window, holding her cell phone high in the air, trying to figure out why she suddenly had no cellular network. She noticed the neighbor across the street walking a dog and realized she could probably catch their unsecured guest Wi-Fi network if she stood close enough to the glass. I watched as she quickly connected her phone to the neighbor's internet. She turned to DeAndre and announced that she was going to order a breakfast pizza from the local diner down the street because the kids had not eaten since yesterday afternoon. Elaine sat in her armchair looking hollow and defeated. She opened her purse and pulled out the blue debit card linked to the legacy joint account. She handed it to Keisha with a trembling hand, telling her to use this card because it was directly tied to a checking account and could not be blocked like a credit card. Elaine still did not understand the depth of my control. She genuinely believed she had found a loophole in my system. Keisha quickly typed the card numbers into the food delivery application on her phone. She added a large breakfast pizza, 2 orders of hash browns, and 3 bottles of orange juice. The total came to $45. She confidently pressed the submit payment button. I watched the screen intently. Keisha's face suddenly dropped. She tapped the screen again harder this time. She let out a frustrated groan and told Elaine that the payment was rejected. She said the app was displaying a message that the card was reported lost or stolen, and the issuing bank had frozen the transaction. DeAndre stopped pacing. He walked over to Keisha and snatched the phone out of her hand, reading the error message for himself. He threw the phone onto the couch in disgust. He looked at Elaine, and his voice was shaking with a mixture of rage and absolute terror. He said, "It is all gone. Every single card, every account, every utility." She shut it all down. The brutal realization finally started to sink in for all of them. For years they had treated me like a disposable accessory. They had belittled my career, called me an ice queen, and pushed me to the margins of the family. But in the harsh daylight of that sweltering, powerless house, they finally understood the truth. I was not just a family member who chipped in for groceries. I was the engine that powered their entire reality. Without me, Elaine was not a wealthy suburban matriarch. She was an unemployed woman with no assets and no credit. Without me, Keisha and DeAndre were not a struggling young family looking for a break. They were destitute squatters trapped in a house they did not own, with no way to feed their own children. I had carried them on my back for so long that they had forgotten how to walk on their own 2 feet, and now I had simply stopped walking. Keisha sank to the floor next to her children and buried her face in her hands. She sobbed loudly, mourning the loss of the comfortable life she had always taken for granted. Elaine stared blankly at the wall, the heavy weight of her own hubris crushing her chest. She had thrown my designer bags onto the lawn to make room for her preferred daughter, and in doing so, she had evicted herself from modern society. The SUV pulled up to the grand stone steps of the county courthouse. I closed my laptop and stepped out into the humid morning air. My attorney, Valerie, was already waiting for me by the security checkpoint. She was holding a thick manila folder and wearing a sharp gray suit that commanded immediate respect. We shook hands, and she guided me through the metal detectors and toward the family court division. As we walked down the marble hallway, Valerie briefed me on the legal strategy. She had drafted the emergency illegal detainer based on my status as the sole owner of the limited liability company that held the property deed. Because Elaine, Keisha, and DeAndre had never signed a lease and paid 0 rent, they were legally classified as at-will tenants or guests. Furthermore, because I had video evidence of DeAndre destroying the custom door and breaking into my fireproof safe, we had clear grounds for an emergency order of protection due to domestic vandalism and threats to property. We entered the judge's chambers shortly after 9 o'clock. The judge was an older woman with a stern face and absolutely no patience for nonsense. Valerie presented the deed of trust, the LLC ownership documents, and a tablet loaded with the security camera footage from the previous night. The judge watched the video of DeAndre wielding the steel crowbar and shattering the heavy oak door of my office. She watched him rip open the safe and throw my legal documents across the room in a fit of rage. Then she reviewed the audio transcript of my mother standing on the front porch, explicitly kicking me out of the residence and calling me a parasite. The judge looked up from the tablet and adjusted her glasses. She looked directly at me and asked if I felt unsafe returning to my own property. I answered clearly and confidently. I told her that my family had forcibly removed me from my home, destroyed my professional workspace, and explicitly threatened my physical security. I stated that I wanted them removed from the premises immediately before they could cause any further damage to the structure or my remaining belongings. The judge nodded in agreement. She picked up her pen and signed the emergency eviction order. She then signed the order of protection specifically barring DeAndre from coming within 500 feet of me or my property. She handed the heavy stack of signed documents to a court clerk and instructed him to have the sheriff's department execute the orders immediately. Valerie thanked the judge and we walked out of the chambers. The legal hammer had just dropped with absolute precision. The digital eviction had trapped them and starved their resources, but the physical eviction was about to forcefully drag them out into the light. Valerie looked at her watch and smiled. She said the sheriff's deputies usually take about 45 minutes to process the paperwork and arrive at the address. She asked if I wanted to ride with her in her car to meet the police at the property. I nodded. I would not miss this for the world. We walked out of the courthouse and got into Valerie's car. As we drove toward Fairfield, my phone vibrated in my purse. It was a local police dispatch number. An officer informed me that 2 cruisers were en route to my address to serve a mandatory vacate order and investigate a reported felony property damage incident. I confirmed that I was also on my way and would provide access to the home. I looked out the window at the passing trees, feeling a profound sense of closure approaching. My mother had always manipulated the narrative to make me look like the villain of the family. She had convinced everyone that my boundaries were acts of cruelty. But today, the narrative was entirely out of her control. Today, the consequences of her entitlement were arriving in black and white police cruisers with flashing lights. The engine she had tried to destroy was about to run her over. But the legal system does not always move at the exact speed of our desires. As Valerie navigated the heavy black SUV toward the Fairfield exit, her dashboard display lit up with an incoming call from the county dispatcher. Valerie answered on speakerphone, keeping her eyes on the road. The dispatcher sounded exhausted and apologized profusely through the static of the car speakers. She explained that the sheriff's department was currently dealing with a massive multi-car pileup on the interstate, and all non-emergency civil actions, including evictions, were being pushed back due to manpower shortages. The deputies would not be able to serve the vacate order and investigate the property damage until 6 o'clock the following morning. Valerie glanced at me with a sympathetic grimace, fully expecting me to be furious about the delay. Instead, I smiled and leaned back against the cool leather headrest. I told her that was perfectly fine. I told her that one more night in that house would be the ultimate educational experience for my family. Valerie turned the car around at the next exit and dropped me back at the sweeping entrance of my luxury hotel. I walked through the automatic sliding glass doors of the lobby, feeling completely unbothered. The trap was already set and locked into place. A delay only meant the pressure inside the house would continue to build until it reached a breaking point. I spent the entire afternoon working remotely from the plush velvet sofa in my suite. I am a lead developer for a major financial technology firm, and my professional life does not stop simply because my family decided to stage a hostile takeover of my personal life. I wrote thousands of lines of code, optimized complex database queries, and confidently led 2 international conference calls, all while keeping my home security camera feed running on a secondary monitor. The stark contrast between my calm, productive environment and the absolute chaos unfolding in my former home was staggering to witness. By early evening, the temperature outside in Fairfield had dropped slightly as the sun dipped below the tree line, but the heavy, suffocating humidity remained firmly trapped inside the heavily insulated walls of the house. The backup battery for the smart home system was steadily and mercilessly draining. It was currently sitting at 15% capacity. That single battery was the only thing keeping the emergency LED lighting illuminated, and the refrigerator's compressor occasionally cycling to keep the remaining food cool. Keisha was sitting on the kitchen floor feeding her children dry cereal straight from the cardboard box because the milk had completely spoiled hours ago. Elaine was sitting in the exact same armchair she had occupied since the morning, looking like a deflated balloon that had lost all its vibrant color. The polished country club matriarch was gone, replaced by a sweaty, terrified woman who was finally realizing she had no actual power. DeAndre was pacing the hardwood floor aggressively. He would walk to the front door every 20 minutes, grab the handle, and yank it to see if the electronic deadbolt had miraculously released its grip. It had not. They were stuck in a sweltering purgatory of their own making, and the worst was yet to come. As the digital clock on my laptop inched closer to midnight, I ordered a late dinner of Wagyu steak and roasted asparagus from the hotel restaurant. I ate slowly, savoring the rich, decadent flavors, while watching the battery percentage on my smart home dashboard drop to 5%. I knew exactly what was going to happen when that number hit 0. When I designed the security architecture for the house, I did not just install a few cameras and a doorbell. I programmed a highly sophisticated fail-secure protocol designed for total grid failure. It was specifically engineered to protect the property from looters or severe damage during hurricanes or prolonged seasonal blackouts. When the main system recognized that the backup battery was dying, it would not simply shut down and leave the house vulnerable. It would trigger a final automated maximum security lockdown. At exactly midnight, the battery indicator on my screen flashed a warning red and then went completely black. The power went out completely, and the real nightmare for my family began. The emergency LED lights in the house flickered twice and died instantly, plunging the interior into absolute suffocating darkness. Through the night vision cameras, I saw the immediate explosion of panic. Heavy steel hurricane shutters, which I had previously concealed within the exterior window frames, automatically deployed. They slammed down over the glass with a terrifyingly loud metallic crash, sealing off the moonlight and any ambient street lighting. The house became an impenetrable sealed tomb. At the exact same moment, the main water line engaged a secondary mechanical solenoid valve. It clamped shut with a heavy thud, completely sealing off even the residual water in the underground pipes. The water was now permanently and irreversibly shut off. But the most critical failure happened at the exits. The electronic smart locks on the front and back doors experienced their programmed glitch. Without the battery reserve to process the manual override command from the inside keypad, the heavy steel security pins remained locked deep inside the reinforced door frames. DeAndre ran through the dark living room, tripping over a coffee table, and grabbed the front door handle. He pulled with all his panicked strength, planting his foot against the wall for leverage, but the solid oak door did not budge a single millimeter. The fail-secure protocol had executed perfectly. They were now officially trapped inside a maximum security vault with no power, no water, no ventilation, and no way to call for help using the disconnected landline. The only lifelines they possessed were their mobile phones, which were barely functioning on the neighbor's weak, unsecured internet signal because I had completely suspended their cellular data plans earlier that morning. 5 minutes after the total lockdown, my cell phone resting on the mahogany nightstand illuminated the dark hotel room. The bright screen displayed an incoming audio call from Elaine. I watched her name flash repeatedly until the call went to my automated voicemail. 10 seconds later, it rang again. Then came a frantic internet call from Keisha using a messaging application. Then DeAndre tried using a completely different number. The phone started blowing up with a frantic, desperate energy that filled the quiet room. 10 calls, 20 calls, 30 calls. The notifications stacked up on my lock screen like a digital avalanche. Text messages began pouring in right after the rapid-fire phone calls. My screen lit up with their terror. Charmaine, please, the house is locked down and the windows are covered. Charmaine, we cannot get the doors open. You need to fix this. Charmaine, the kids are crying and terrified. Please just answer the phone. Charmaine, I am sorry for what I said. Just open the doors and let us out. I read the text messages as they scrolled past, but I felt absolutely nothing. The apologies were entirely meaningless. They were not sorry for how they treated me. They were not sorry for throwing my expensive belongings onto the lawn or calling me a parasite. They were not sorry for attempting to steal my home and my hard-earned assets. They were only sorry that the consequences of their actions were finally holding them hostage in the dark. I watched the missed call counter steadily climb past 50 and eventually hit exactly 70. 70 missed calls. 70 times they reached out to the very daughter they had violently discarded. 70 times they begged the Ice Queen to come save them from the cold, harsh reality of their own incompetence and cruelty. For years I had answered every single call. I had paid every single bill and fixed every single mistake they made. I had sacrificed my own peace of mind to ensure they never had to face the real world. But the woman who used to answer those calls died the moment my mother told me I was no longer family. I picked up my phone and stared at the 70 missed calls glowing against the dark background. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or guilt. They had made their arrogant choices standing on that front porch laughing proudly as they stripped me of my dignity. Now they were reaping the bitter harvest they had so eagerly planted. I swiped down on the control center of my phone screen. I pressed the small moon icon, activating the Do Not Disturb mode. The screen went blessedly dark, and the relentless vibrating finally stopped, leaving my hotel suite in total absolute silence. I walked into the spacious marble bathroom and washed my face with warm, soothing water. I dried my skin with a thick plush towel and opened my suitcase. I slipped into a luxurious, pure silk robe that draped elegantly and coolly over my shoulders. The fabric felt incredibly soft against my skin, a physical reminder of the beautiful life I had built for myself. I walked back into the bedroom and climbed into the massive king-sized bed, pulling the crisp white down duvet over my legs. I fluffed the expensive feather pillows and settled in. Tomorrow morning, the sheriff would arrive with the heavy iron keys and the legal authority to drag my family out into the blinding morning light. Tomorrow, they would face the police, the eviction, and the total ruin of their financial lives. But tonight, while they sweated in the pitch-black heat of a house they tried to steal, I was going to sleep perfectly. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath of the air-conditioned room, and let the silence carry me away. I slept soundly through the night, undisturbed by the chaos I knew was unfolding miles away. When I woke up, the sun was just beginning to stream through the sheer curtains of my hotel suite, painting the room in a soft golden light. I felt incredibly refreshed. The heavy burden of managing my family's manufactured crises had completely vanished. I picked up my phone from the nightstand and tapped the screen to disable the Do Not Disturb mode. The device instantly vibrated violently in my hand as a flood of delayed notifications poured in. The missed call counter had climbed to an astonishing 112. The text messages were a barrage of escalating panic and venom. Elaine alone had sent over 80 messages. The early texts were demanding and arrogant. "Come back here right now and fix this system. You are acting like a petulant child." Then, as the reality of the lockdown set in, the tone shifted to desperation. "Charmaine, the doors will not open. We cannot breathe in here. DeAndre is breaking things trying to get out. Please just open the doors." By 3 in the morning, the messages had devolved into pure, unhinged vitriol. "You are a traitor. You are no daughter of mine. How could you leave your own mother and your innocent nieces and nephews to bake in the dark? You are a monster." I scrolled through the messages while I walked to the marble bathroom to brush my teeth. I felt a detached sense of amusement. They were trapped in a fortress of my design, and instead of reflecting on the actions that put them there, they were still trying to cast me as the villain. I rinsed my mouth, dried my face, and walked back to the bedroom. I sat on the edge of the plush mattress and decided it was finally time to break the silence. I opened Elaine's contact and pressed the call button. The phone did not even ring a full time before the call connected. Elaine's voice came through the speaker, raw and frantic. "Charmaine, is that you? Where are you? You need to come back and fix this house right now. We have been trapped in the dark all night and the kids are sick from the heat. DeAndre broke a window trying to get out, but the metal shutters will not budge. You are going to pay for this." I let her rant for a few seconds, absorbing the sheer audacity of her demands. When she paused for breath, my voice was perfectly level. I said, "Good morning to you too, Elaine. It sounds like you are having some trouble adjusting to your new living situation." Elaine shrieked into the receiver. "Adjusting? You locked us in a vault. We have no water, no power, and no air. You need to unlock these doors right this second before I call the police and have you arrested for kidnapping." I smiled. I said, "You cannot call the police, Elaine. Your cell phone service has been suspended. The only reason you are able to talk to me right now is because Keisha is leeching off the neighbor's Wi-Fi signal. And even if you could call the police, what exactly would you tell them?" That the owner of the house locked the doors to secure her property after you violently evicted her. I think the police would be much more interested in why you are trespassing. There was a brief stunned silence on the other end of the line. The reality of her powerlessness was finally penetrating her thick shell of entitlement. She stammered out a response, trying to regain her footing. "This is my house, Charmaine. I am your mother. You cannot treat me like this. You need to come back here and turn everything back on. Family does not do this to family." I laughed a short, humorless sound. Family. Is that what we are? That is not what you called me yesterday when you threw my luggage onto the lawn. You called me a parasite. You told me my life was too easy, and that I did not understand the meaning of family. You said Keisha needed the space because she is actually raising a family while I was just taking up room. So I left. I took my parasitic self away so you and Keisha could enjoy the house. Why would a parasite come back to help the host? Elaine's voice cracked. I did not mean it like that. I was just upset. Keisha needed a place to stay, and you have enough money to go anywhere. You are being unreasonable. I cut her off sharply. No, Elaine. I am being exactly what you raised me to be. I am being resilient. I am being independent. I am being the cold, unfeeling ice queen you always accused me of being. For 3 years, I paid the mortgage, the taxes, the utilities, and the insurance on that house. I created an LLC to buy the debt so you would not lose your precious country club status when Dad died. I funded your entire lifestyle while you treated me like an unwanted guest in my own home. And the moment Keisha needed a place to crash, you decided I was disposable. I heard Keisha crying in the background. Her voice echoed through the phone, begging our mother to just make me turn the power back on. Elaine ignored her and tried a different tactic. Charmaine, please. I am your mother. I carried you for 9 months. You owe me respect. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the bustling city streets. I do not owe you anything, Elaine. Respect is earned, not demanded. And you lost my respect the day of Dad's funeral when you paraded Keisha around as the grieving widow while I handled every single detail of burying my father. You lost my respect every time you handed Keisha my credit card to buy designer clothes while complaining that I worked too much. You lost my respect yesterday when you smiled while DeAndre called me a failure. DeAndre's voice suddenly boomed through the speaker. He must have snatched the phone from Elaine's hand. Look here, Charmaine, you crazy witch. You better unlock these doors right now. I already smashed the glass in the back door. If you do not let us out, I am going to tear this whole house apart board by board until I find a way out. My voice dropped an octave, becoming deadly serious. I would not advise that, DeAndre. You already caused over $5,000 in property damage when you took a crowbar to my office door and broke into my safe. I have the entire incident recorded in high definition on my cloud server. You broke into a locked room, destroyed custom cabinetry, and attempted to steal legal documents. That is a felony. If you touch another piece of my property, I will ensure the police add willful destruction of property to your incoming charges. DeAndre scoffed, trying to sound tough, but the fear in his voice was palpable. You are bluffing. There are no cameras in this house. I replied smoothly. Really? Then how do I know you are currently wearing those red basketball shorts and standing near the kitchen island with a piece of cardboard in your hand? How do I know Keisha is sitting on the floor feeding the kids dry cereal? How do I know Elaine is wearing the same blue silk blouse she had on yesterday? The silence that followed was absolute. They realized they were not just trapped, they were being observed. The illusion of their privacy had been shattered along with their sense of control. Elaine took the phone back. Her voice was barely a whisper now, stripped of all its usual bravado. What do you want, Charmaine? What do you want us to do? I want you to sit there and think about the choices you made. I want you to feel what it is like to be completely helpless. You spent my entire life taking my strength for granted and weaponizing my success against me. You thought you could just discard me and keep the resources I provided. You thought you were the ones in charge. I want you to understand down to your very bones that you only survived because I allowed it. And I am no longer allowing it. Elaine started sobbing. It was not a performative cry for sympathy. It was the genuine sound of a woman whose entire world had just collapsed. Charmaine, please. We have no food, we have no water. The house is like an oven. Please just let us out. We will leave. We will pack our things and go. Just open the doors." I looked at my watch. It was just past 8 in the morning. I had a meeting with my development team at 9 and I did not want to be late. The sheriff's deputies were scheduled to arrive at the Fairfield property at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning to execute the legal eviction and investigate the property damage. I had no intention of letting them out early to potentially destroy more of my home or flee before the police arrived. "I am sorry, Elaine, but the fail-secure protocol on the smart home system cannot be overridden remotely once the backup battery is completely dead. The system requires a manual hard reset from the main breaker box, which is conveniently located in the locked basement. And since none of you have the key to the basement, you are going to have to wait until someone comes to manually open the doors from the outside." Keisha shrieked in the background. When? When is someone coming?" I smiled even though they could not see it. "Sometime tomorrow morning. I suggest you all find a comfortable spot on the floor and conserve your energy. And Elaine, the next time you decide to call someone a parasite, make sure you are not the one actually sucking the life out of them." I ended the call and blocked all 3 of their phone numbers from reaching my device. I had delivered the message and I had no desire to listen to their begging or their empty threats for another 24 hours. The confrontation was over and the verdict had been delivered. They were guilty of gross entitlement, and their sentence was another night in the sweltering dark prison of their own making. I walked over to the minibar and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. The cool carbonated liquid felt incredibly refreshing against my throat. I felt a profound sense of liberation. The toxic ties that had bound me to my family for 35 years were finally severed. I was no longer the reliable bank account, the scapegoat, or the invisible workhorse. I was just Charmaine, a successful software developer who was finally living solely for herself. I opened my laptop and joined my team's video conference call right on time. I reviewed code deployments, discussed project timelines, and strategized new features with a clear and focused mind. My colleagues commented on how refreshed and energetic I looked. I simply smiled and told them I had finally resolved a very complicated legacy system issue that had been draining my resources for years. They nodded in professional agreement, completely unaware that the legacy system I was referring to was my own family. As the workday progressed, I occasionally checked the camera feeds from the Fairfield house. The interior was still pitch black, but the night vision cameras captured the grim reality of their situation. They had stopped fighting with each other. The sheer exhaustion of the heat and the lack of food and water had completely drained their energy. They were simply existing lying on the floor or slumped in chairs waiting for a rescue that was still hours away. The golden child, the demanding matriarch, and the entitled husband had all been reduced to their most basic, desperate selves. The digital eviction had been flawlessly executed. The trap had worked perfectly. Now all that was left was the final physical removal. I closed my laptop at 5 o'clock and ordered a celebratory dinner to my room. Tomorrow I would watch the sheriff's deputies drag them out into the light. Tomorrow the parasite would officially reclaim the host. But the night was far from over, and DeAndre was a man rapidly unraveling under the pressure of his own failures. As the sun set on the second day of their captivity, the Fairfield house plunged back into total darkness. The emergency LED lights that had provided a faint glow earlier were completely dead now. The only illumination came from the weak flashlights on their dying cell phones. The temperature inside had plateaued at a miserable 92 degrees. The thick insulation of the colonial home, designed to keep out the bitter Connecticut winters, was now acting like a heavy wool blanket, trapping the heat and the humidity inside the sealed rooms. They were dehydrated, starving, and exhausted. I watched them through the battery-operated hidden cameras I had strategically placed throughout the house months ago. These cameras were not tied to the main electrical grid or the primary smart home system. They ran on independent, long-lasting lithium power cells and transmitted their encrypted video feeds via a dedicated cellular uplink I had installed in the attic for precisely this kind of total grid failure. They were completely invisible, flush-mounted into the crown molding and equipped with military-grade infrared night vision. The system was flawless, and it gave me a front-row seat to the final collapse of my family's sanity. DeAndre could not sit still. The oppressive heat and the crushing weight of his own powerlessness were driving him mad. He paced the living room like a caged animal, sweating profusely through his undershirt. He kept muttering to himself about needing cash. He knew they were going to be thrown out in the morning. My phone call had confirmed that the sheriff's deputies were coming. He knew they had no money for a hotel, no money for food, and certainly no money to hire a defense attorney. He needed liquid assets immediately, and his greedy mind was absolutely convinced that I had them hidden somewhere in the house. He believed that because I was a wealthy software developer, I must have a secret stash of luxury goods or stacks of $100 bills tucked away for a rainy day. He walked over to the corner of the living room and picked up the heavy steel crowbar he had used to smash his way into my office yesterday. He gripped the cold metal tightly and turned toward the hallway. Elaine yelled from the armchair, her voice raspy and weak from dehydration. She asked him where he was going and begged him to stop destroying the house. She told him he was only making things worse. DeAndre ignored her completely. He was a man possessed, driven by a primal need to exert physical control over a situation he could not intellectually comprehend. He marched down the hallway and stepped back into my home office. The solid oak door was already splintered and hanging off its hinges from his previous tantrum, but the room itself was still largely intact. He swept his phone flashlight across the space. He had already broken into the small, basic firebox on the floor yesterday, but he knew me better than to think I would leave my most valuable possessions in such an obvious and vulnerable place. That firebox was a decoy, and DeAndre's desperate instincts told him the real prize was still hidden in this room. He started tearing the sanctuary apart. He pulled heavy textbooks and technical manuals off the custom mahogany shelves, ripping the pages and throwing them onto the floor. He used the crowbar to smash the drywall behind the desk, looking for hollow spaces. He was completely unhinged, swinging the heavy steel bar with reckless abandon. The sound of shattering drywall and splintering wood echoed through the silent house like gunshots. Behind the heaviest bookcase in the corner of the room, he finally noticed a strange, unnatural seam in the wood paneling. He dropped his phone onto the desk, angling the light toward the corner, and wedged the crowbar into the narrow gap. He planted his feet, grabbed the bar with both hands, and yanked backward with all his body weight. The wood panel snapped off with a loud crack, revealing a flush-mounted solid steel wall safe. It was a high-end biometric model, heavily reinforced, and designed to withstand extreme heat and brute force attacks. DeAndre's eyes went wide in the glow of the flashlight. He smiled a feral, greedy smile, revealing his absolute desperation. He muttered to himself that he had finally found the jackpot. He was completely convinced that this impenetrable steel box was where I kept my expensive jewelry, my imported luxury watches, and the emergency cash reserves he always assumed rich people hoarded. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and prepared to break the vault. He spent the next hour working on that safe. I watched the entire grueling ordeal on my laptop screen from the cool comfort of my hotel bed, sipping a cup of chamomile tea. DeAndre sweat through his clothes, grunting and cursing as he repeatedly struck the steel hinges with the heavy crowbar. The metal groaned and warped under the relentless, violent assault. His hands were bleeding from the friction, and he was panting heavily, gasping for air in the 90-degree room, but the blinding greed kept him swinging. He was determined to steal my wealth to save himself. Finally, after an hour of brute force destruction, a deafening metallic crack split the air. The heavy locking mechanism shattered internally. DeAndre dropped the crowbar, which clattered loudly against the hardwood floor, and dropped to his knees. He grabbed the heavy steel door and pulled it open. He reached his bloodied hands into the dark cavity of the safe, fully expecting to pull out velvet jewelry boxes and thick banded stacks of cash. Instead, his hands closed around a single heavy-bound leather portfolio. He paused, confusion washing over his sweaty face. He pulled the thick portfolio out and dragged it into the beam of his flashlight. He opened the leather cover, frantically tearing through the heavy parchment pages inside. There was no jewelry. There was no cash. There were no bearer bonds or gold coins. There was only the official master deed to the Fairfield property, the full certified articles of organization for my limited liability company, and the airtight legal trust documents that explicitly named me as the sole owner and primary beneficiary of the entire estate. He flipped to the back pages and saw the notarized signatures and the heavy embossed state seals. He saw the ironclad legal clauses that strictly forbade any unauthorized tenants from establishing residency without my explicit written consent. He stared at the documents in his shaking hands. The fatal mistake finally crystallized in his mind. He had just spent his last ounce of physical energy violently breaking into a highly secure safe, only to find the exact legal paperwork that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was a criminal trespassing on my property. He had destroyed thousands of dollars of custom architecture and committed felony breaking and entering to uncover the very evidence that would send him directly to a state penitentiary. What DeAndre did not know was that the hidden camera directly above the bookcase was recording his face in crystal clear infrared high definition. The camera had an integrated motion sensor and an audio microphone so sensitive it picked up his ragged breathing and the sound of the paper rustling in his hands. I watched him realize the sheer magnitude of his catastrophic error. He had escalated a simple trespassing and illegal detainer charge into felony destruction of property and attempted grand larceny. And he had done it all while providing me with the perfect, undeniable video evidence to hand straight to the district attorney. Keisha walked into the ruined office holding her youngest child on her hip. She looked at the smashed drywall, the shattered wooden panels, and the broken steel safe. She asked DeAndre in a hopeful whisper if he had found the money. She said they needed to order a car to get out of the house the second the doors finally unlocked in the morning. DeAndre slowly turned around, still clutching the leather portfolio. He looked at his wife with eyes completely devoid of hope. His voice was hollow and defeated. He told her there was no money. He told her Charmaine owned every single nail in the walls, every brick in the foundation, and every blade of grass outside. He dropped the portfolio onto the floor and told Keisha that they were not going to a hotel tomorrow. They were going to jail. Elaine stumbled into the room a moment later, drawn by the noise of the destruction and Keisha's sudden terrified sobbing. She looked at the devastation her son-in-law had caused. She looked at the legal documents scattered across the floor, detailing the massive financial empire I had quietly built to protect her. She finally understood that her illusion of control was not just broken, it was legally non-existent. She had traded a fiercely loyal daughter who provided everything for an entitled son-in-law who destroyed everything he touched. I took a final sip of my tea and closed the laptop. The trap had snapped shut with absolute perfection. DeAndre had dug his own grave and jumped right in. I turned off the lamp on my nightstand and lay back against the pillows. In a few hours, the sun would rise, the sheriff would arrive, and the parasite would be permanently surgically removed from my life. But the legal framework required to make that removal absolute had to be reinforced one final time. I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning, skipping breakfast and opting only for a strong double espresso. I dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, pinned my hair back into a sleek low bun, and grabbed my leather briefcase. I walked out into the cool pre-dawn air of the city and hailed a car. It was time to meet Valerie one last time before the main event. Valerie's office was located in a sleek, modern high-rise downtown. When I arrived, the receptionist immediately ushered me into a glass-walled conference room overlooking the waking city. Valerie was already there, sipping green tea and organizing a stack of thick legal files. She looked up as I entered and offered a sharp, professional smile. She pushed a freshly printed stack of documents across the polished mahogany table. Valerie told me that she had spent the evening reviewing the raw footage from the hidden camera in my office. She said she had seen a lot of desperate people do stupid things in her career, but watching DeAndre destroy a custom steel safe to steal an LLC operating agreement was easily in her top 5. I sat down and pulled the documents toward me. I told her that his stupidity was the key that finally unlocked my total freedom. Valerie tapped the top file with her manicured fingernail. She explained that she had drafted the final emergency order of protection based heavily on the new felony footage. The judge had already approved the preliminary order yesterday, but this new evidence of severe ongoing property destruction upgraded the situation to a highly volatile domestic threat. DeAndre was no longer just a trespasser. He was a documented violent offender actively destroying an occupied dwelling. But Valerie was a thorough attorney, and she wanted to make sure every single loophole was permanently closed. She opened a secondary file and pulled out a heavy parchment document sealed in a plastic sleeve. It was the original master trust agreement. She slid it across the table for my final review. She told me that many people assume owning a house in an LLC is enough protection, but she reminded me why we structured my assets through a deeply layered blind trust. She pointed to a specific heavily bolded paragraph on page 4. The legal language was dense, but the implication was devastatingly clear. The property was owned by the LLC, but the LLC was entirely controlled by the Ruby Star Trust. And the bylaws of that trust explicitly stated that the primary residence could only be occupied by the sole trustee, which was me or an authorized dependent explicitly named in writing. Valerie looked me directly in the eyes. She said, "Your mother claims you were a guest in her house. She claims she has tenant rights because she has lived there for 3 years. But she has never paid a dime of rent. She has never signed a lease. And most importantly, the trust legally forbids her from establishing residency without a notarized affidavit from you. Legally speaking, Elaine is not a tenant. She is not a guest. For the past 3 years, she has been an unauthorized occupant living solely on your undocumented charity. And the moment she told you to leave, she effectively terminated that charity." I traced the words on the page with my finger, feeling the heavy weight of the legal protection I had built for myself. My mother had always relied on emotional manipulation to get what she wanted. She believed that guilt and obligation were stronger than any written contract. She was about to find out that a judge in a court of law does not care about family guilt trips. A judge only cares about the ink on the paper. I picked up the heavy gold pen Valerie offered me. I signed my name on the final page of the emergency order of protection. I signed my name on the updated illegal detainer warrant. I initialed every single page of the property damage report, explicitly outlining the estimated replacement costs for the oak door, the drywall, the mahogany shelving, and the biometric safe. The total estimated damage was over $12,000. Valerie collected the signed documents and placed them carefully into a thick manila envelope. She checked her watch. It was 5:45. She said the sheriff's deputies are meeting us at the property at exactly 6:15. They have the duplicate keys you provided, and they have the authority to breach the doors if necessary. Because of the felony warrant for DeAndre, they are treating this as a high-risk eviction. I nodded, feeling a cold calm settle over me. I thanked Valerie for her meticulous work. She simply smiled and said she loved seeing smart women protect their assets from toxic liabilities. We walked out of the office building together and got into her waiting SUV. The drive out to Fairfield was quiet. The sun was just beginning to break over the horizon, casting long shadows across the suburban lawns. As we pulled onto my street, I saw 2 heavily marked sheriff's cruisers already parked discreetly near the entrance of my driveway. 4 deputies in full tactical gear were standing near the vehicles reviewing the paperwork. Valerie parked the SUV behind the cruisers and we stepped out into the crisp morning air. The lead deputy, a tall, broad-shouldered man, approached us. He confirmed my identity and asked me to verify the layout of the house. I quickly sketched a mental map for him, detailing the location of the bedrooms, the broken office door, and the reinforced steel security shutters that were currently sealing the house. I handed him the master digital override key, which I had programmed specifically for law enforcement access. The deputy nodded, his expression completely serious. He said, "Given the suspect's violent behavior overnight, we are going to enter the property quickly and secure all individuals before allowing you inside to assess the damage." He asked me to remain near the vehicles until the house was fully cleared. I agreed and watched as the 4 deputies moved in a highly coordinated tactical formation toward the front porch. The Fairfield house looked like a dark, silent fortress. The steel shutters reflected the early morning light, giving the colonial structure an intimidating industrial appearance. Inside, I knew my family was exhausted, terrified, and completely unaware that their final moments of control were evaporating. The lead deputy inserted the master digital key into the exterior deadbolt panel. The device beeped twice, and the heavy steel locking pins finally retracted with a loud clank. The deputy kicked the heavy oak door open, and the team flooded into the dark, sweltering house, yelling verbal commands. "Sheriff's Department, nobody move, show me your hands." The shouting echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood. I stood near Valerie's SUV, listening to the chaotic symphony of my family's ultimate downfall. I heard a loud crash, which I later learned was DeAndre tripping over a chair as he tried to run toward the back patio. I heard Keisha screaming hysterically, trying to grab her crying children. And over the din of the chaos, I heard Elaine's voice shrill and indignant, demanding to know what the police were doing in her home. I leaned against the hood of the car, feeling the warm metal beneath my hands. The legal hammer had not just dropped, it had completely leveled the foundation of their arrogance. They had spent years telling me I was worthless, that I was a parasite, that I owed them my success. But the law had just officially declared that they owed me everything. 5 minutes later, the front door opened again. The lead deputy walked out, holding DeAndre firmly by the arm. DeAndre's hands were cuffed tightly behind his back. He was still wearing the same sweaty undershirt, and his face was a mask of absolute terror. He was not acting tough anymore. He was practically shaking as the deputy guided him down the porch steps and toward the waiting cruiser. As DeAndre passed by Valerie's SUV, he saw me standing there. He stopped struggling for a brief second and glared at me with pure hatred. He spat on the ground near my shoes and called me a cold-hearted bitch. He said I was going to rot in hell for doing this to my own family. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at him and said, "You broke into a federal safe, DeAndre. That carries a minimum sentence of 3 years. I suggest you save your breath for your public defender." The deputy shoved DeAndre forward, forcing his head down as he loaded him into the back of the police car. A moment later, Keisha emerged from the house, clutching her 2 young children tightly. She looked completely broken. Her hair was matted, her clothes were stained with sweat, and she was sobbing uncontrollably. A female deputy was guiding her gently but firmly toward the driveway. Keisha looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. She did not yell. She did not curse. She just walked past me. Her head hung low, completely defeated by the reality she had brought upon herself. Finally, Elaine walked out onto the porch. She was not in handcuffs, but 2 deputies were flanking her closely. The polished country club facade was entirely gone. She looked like an old, frail woman. She was holding a single small overnight bag, which the deputies had allowed her to pack. She stood on the porch looking out at the police cars, her arrested son-in-law, and her homeless daughter. She slowly turned her head and met my gaze. I expected her to yell. I expected her to hurl one final insult or try to guilt me one last time. But she just stared at me, her eyes empty and hollow. She finally understood that the well had run completely dry. The parasite had survived, and the host had just been officially evicted. To truly comprehend the absolute defeat in Elaine's eyes as she stood on that porch that morning, we have to rewind the clock to the horrific events that unfolded inside the house during the final 12 hours of their lockdown. The physical eviction with the sheriff's deputies was simply the grand finale of a psychological and physical siege that had already completely broken their spirits. I had watched the entire unraveling on my hidden cameras, and the destruction they brought upon themselves the night before was a masterpiece of poetic justice. By 7 o'clock on the evening before the eviction, the Fairfield house had descended into a primitive state. The electric company had processed my disconnection order, and the house was plunged into darkness. The sun had set, but the thick insulation of the walls held the 90-degree heat captive, turning the spacious colonial into a sweltering brick oven. Without electricity, they had to navigate the sprawling floor plan by the weak glow of cell phone flashlights until the batteries dipped into the red zone. Desperate to save their phones, Keisha and Elaine began rummaging through the dark cabinets. They eventually found Elaine's collection of expensive imported decorative candles. These were $80 luxury candles meant for upscale dinner parties, and now they were scattered across the kitchen island and the living room coffee table, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. The dim candlelight only amplified the suffocating tension in the room. The children were crying softly from the heat and hunger. DeAndre was pacing the hardwood floors, his undershirt completely soaked in sweat. His frustration was boiling over, and his fragile ego could not handle the reality of being bested by the sister-in-law he had always mocked. He convinced himself that the air conditioning was simply locked behind a digital firewall that he could bypass with a little brute force. He declared to the room that he was going to hotwire the system directly from the main control panel. Elaine, sitting in the candlelight wiping her forehead with a damp cloth, weakly told him to leave it alone. She said he did not know anything about complex smart home wiring and he was going to make it worse. But DeAndre ignored her. He grabbed a heavy flashlight and a toolkit from the garage and marched over to the main HVAC return closet in the hallway. He ripped the vented door open and stared at the intricate array of motherboards, copper wiring, and digital relays that controlled the state-of-the-art climate system I had installed. I watched the camera feed in disbelief as he jammed a flathead screwdriver into the primary control box. He started violently yanking out the low-voltage wires trying to cross the connections to force the heavy compressor outside to turn on. He did not realize that the system was running on a highly sensitive digital communication bus. He crossed a live 24-volt wire directly onto the main processor board. A loud pop echoed through the hallway, followed by a bright shower of blue sparks. The smell of ozone and melting plastic instantly filled the stagnant air of the house. A thin trail of black smoke curled out of the control box. DeAndre coughed and stumbled backward, dropping the screwdriver. He had completely fried the central processing unit of a $15,000 climate control system. Keisha ran into the hallway holding a candle, her face twisted in anger. She looked at the smoking wires and screamed at him. She asked him what he had just done. DeAndre defensively yelled back that he was trying to fix the mess her family put them in. This ignited the most vicious argument I had ever witnessed between them. The polite fiction of their happy marriage completely evaporated in the sweltering heat. Keisha called DeAndre a useless failure. She screamed that he had never provided a single thing for her or the children. She pointed a shaking finger at him and yelled that they were only in this dark, hot house because he could not hold down a job to pay rent on their apartment. She said, "Charmaine was right about you. You are nothing but a burden." DeAndre stepped forward, his voice booming through the empty house. He fired back, calling Keisha a spoiled brat who expected everyone else to fund her lifestyle. He yelled that she was just as broke and pathetic as her mother, and that the only reason she married him was because she knew no successful man would ever put up with her constant complaining. They tore each other down, stripping away every defense mechanism and exposing the bitter, resentful core of their relationship. The golden child was finally hearing the truth about her life, and it was breaking her. Elaine interrupted the screaming match. She walked into the hallway, coughing from the smell of burnt plastic. Her priority was not their marriage, it was the suffocating heat. She used Keisha's phone, which was still weakly connected to the neighbor's Wi-Fi signal, to search for an emergency 24-hour HVAC repair service. She found a local contractor and begged them to send a technician immediately, claiming it was a medical emergency due to the children. Because it was barely 8 o'clock in the evening, the electronic deadbolts had not yet entered the midnight fail-secure lockdown protocol, so the front door could still be manually opened from the inside. 45 minutes later, a heavy white utility van pulled into the driveway. A tired-looking technician carrying a heavy canvas tool bag knocked on the front door. DeAndre manually turned the lock and let the man inside. The technician stepped into the dark candlelit foyer and immediately wiped the sweat from his brow. He looked around, confused by the absolute lack of power, but Elaine rushed forward, using her most authoritative country club voice. She directed him to the hallway closet, demanding that he bypass the smart thermostat and get the cold air flowing immediately. The technician aimed his heavy-duty flashlight into the closet. He inspected the charred motherboard, the melted wires, and the blackened relays. He let out a long, low whistle. He turned to Elaine and shook his head. He explained that someone had intentionally bypassed the safety relays and sent a massive power surge directly through the delicate communication board. The entire brain of the system was completely destroyed. He said he could not just bypass it. He would have to completely rip out the main control unit, install a temporary analog board, and rewire the entire zone control system just to get the fan to spin. Elaine demanded that he do it right, then and there. The technician pulled a digital tablet from his bag and started tapping on the screen. He looked up and delivered the fatal blow. He said for an emergency after hours rebuild of this magnitude, replacing proprietary parts that were intentionally destroyed, the cost would be $4,000. And because the home currently had no active utility accounts, a fact he easily verified through his company dispatch system, he required the payment upfront in full before he touched a single tool. The silence in the hallway was deafening. $4,000 might as well have been $4 million to them in that moment. Elaine confidently reached into her purse and pulled out the blue Legacy debit card, the very same card I had frozen earlier that morning. She handed it to the technician and told him to run it. The technician attached a small card reader to his tablet and swiped the plastic. The machine beeped a harsh, angry tone. The screen flashed bright red with the word declined. Elaine's face drained of whatever color it had left. She stammered, insisting there was plenty of money in that account, and told him to try it again. He swiped it a second time. Declined. The technician looked at Elaine with a mixture of pity and annoyance. He told her the bank was issuing a hard stop on the transaction, reporting the card as frozen or invalid. He unhooked the card reader, handed the useless piece of plastic back to my mother, and picked up his heavy tool bag. DeAndre stepped forward, trying to intimidate the technician. He demanded that the man fix the unit on credit, promising to pay him the next day. The technician laughed a dry, humorless sound. He looked DeAndre up and down, noting the sweaty undershirt and the aggressive posture. He said, "I do not work for free, buddy. When you get the cash, give us a call." The technician walked out the front door and let it slam shut behind him. The heavy thud of the door closing signaled the absolute end of their hope. Elaine stared at the blue debit card in her hand, finally processing the terrifying reality of my financial reach. I had not just turned off the lights, I had systematically hunted down and destroyed every single avenue of escape they possessed. Keisha sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, crying quietly into her hands. DeAndre walked back into the living room and kicked the coffee table, sending an expensive Joe Malone candle crashing to the floor, where it shattered into a dozen pieces. This was the broken, shattered family that had eventually dragged themselves to my home office later that night, leading to DeAndre's fatal mistake with the crowbar and the safe. This was the grueling, miserable siege that had completely drained their physical and mental reserves long before the sheriff's deputies ever knocked on the door. By the time the sun rose and the police arrived, they had nothing left to fight with. The arrogance that had allowed them to throw my luggage onto the lawn was entirely burned away in the 90-degree heat, leaving only the pathetic reality of their own failures. So when Elaine stood on that porch looking at me with those hollow, empty eyes surrounded by the flashing lights of the police cruisers, she was not just reacting to an eviction. She was reacting to the absolute, undeniable proof that she could not survive in this world without me. The siege had proven that her entire existence was a luxury funded by the daughter she had treated like dirt. And as I watched the police escort her off my property, I knew she would carry the memory of that sweltering, powerless night for the rest of her life. But the shattered climate control system and the broken safe were only pieces of a much larger criminal puzzle. To fully understand the absolute severity of the charges that kept DeAndre in tight steel handcuffs that morning, we have to look at the final desperate gamble he made just hours before the house went into total midnight lockdown. The eviction was a civil matter, but DeAndre had eagerly crossed the line into serious felony territory all on his own. It happened late in the afternoon on the first day of their hostile takeover. The oppressive heat was already building inside the Fairfield house, and the realization that their credit cards were completely dead had just started to sink in. DeAndre was pacing the garage, trying to figure out a way to generate fast cash. He looked down at the cold concrete floor where he had carelessly tossed my professional workstation the day before. To him, it was just a pile of boring computer junk taking up space where he wanted to put a ping-pong table. But as his desperation grew, he started to see dollar signs. My workstation was not a standard consumer laptop you buy at a big-box electronics store. It was a custom-built enterprise-grade server tower, liquid-cooled and packed with top-tier processing units designed to run complex financial risk algorithms. Paired with it were two ultra-wide, high-definition color-calibrated monitors. The hardware alone was worth over $10,000. DeAndre did not know the exact value, but he knew it looked expensive. He decided that since I was no longer living there, the equipment was essentially abandoned property. I watched through the garage security camera as he backed his beat-up pickup truck into the driveway. He lowered the tailgate and started hauling my equipment into the truck bed. He did not use blankets to protect the screens. He did not secure the heavy server tower with bungee cords. He just shoved the delicate technology into the back of the truck, scratching the custom-brushed aluminum casing against the rusted metal of his tailgate. He slammed the truck bed shut, climbed into the driver's seat, and sped off down the street. Keisha had stood at the doorway asking him where he was going. He confidently told her he was going to a pawn shop a few towns over to turn the Ice Queen's toys into grocery money and hotel cash. He thought he was being resourceful. He thought he had found a brilliant loophole in my financial blockade. What DeAndre failed to realize is that a lead developer for a major financial technology firm does not leave $10,000 of corporate infrastructure unprotected. The server tower was equipped with a military-grade absolute tracking module soldered directly onto the motherboard. It did not rely on local Wi-Fi. It ran on a dedicated independent cellular band and was powered by an internal reserve battery that could transmit a signal for a month even if the main power cord was severed. I was sitting at the small desk in my hotel suite, sipping a glass of iced lemon water when the alert came through. My laptop emitted a sharp, high-pitched chime. A bright red notification banner flashed across the top of my screen, indicating an unauthorized geographical perimeter breach for asset designation 409. I clicked the notification, and a detailed satellite map filled my monitor. A pulsing blue dot was moving steadily down Interstate 95, heading south toward a neighboring city known for its sketchy pawn shops and cash for gold storefronts. I did not panic. I did not call DeAndre to scream at him or demand my property back. Screaming is what victims do when they feel powerless. I felt incredibly powerful. I sat back in my chair and watched the blue dot navigate the highway. He was literally driving himself straight into a grand larceny charge, and I was tracking him with pinpoint digital accuracy. I opened a new tab on my browser and looked up the non-emergency dispatch number for the police precinct located in the jurisdiction where the blue dot was currently slowing down. I dialed the number and asked to speak directly to the Commercial Crimes Division. A gruff-sounding detective answered the phone. I introduced myself clearly and professionally. I informed him that I was reporting the active theft of high-value enterprise technology belonging to a major financial firm. The detective's tone immediately shifted from casual to highly alert. I gave him the exact make, model, and serial numbers of the equipment. I explained that the hardware was valued at over $10,000, easily crossing the threshold for felony grand larceny. But more importantly, I informed him that the server contained encrypted proprietary financial algorithms, making the theft a potential incident of corporate espionage. I told him I had a live GPS tracking lock on the asset, and it had just parked outside a pawn shop on Elm Street. While I was on the phone with the detective, the scene at the pawn shop was playing out exactly as I had anticipated. The blue dot had stopped moving. I could easily picture DeAndre lugging that heavy, scratched server tower through the dingy glass doors of the shop, dropping it onto the glass display counter, and demanding $1,000 in cash. Pawn shop owners, especially the ones operating in rougher districts, are extremely cautious about high-end specialized technology. They know that fencing stolen corporate gear brings the kind of federal heat that can shut a business down permanently. I later acquired the security footage from the pawn shop through my attorney for the civil damages lawsuit, and it was a masterpiece of humiliation. The footage showed the pawnbroker, an older man with thick glasses, looking skeptically at the massive server. He plugged the power cord into a wall outlet and connected a spare keyboard. When he pushed the power button, the system booted up, but it did not go to a standard operating system screen. Instead, the monitor flashed a bright crimson warning screen with a prominent digital padlock icon. The screen displayed a hard-coded message stating that this device was the exclusive property of RS Investments, and unauthorized access was a federal crime. The broker immediately pulled his hands away from the keyboard as if it were radioactive. He looked at DeAndre, who was sweating profusely and tapping his fingers nervously on the glass counter. The broker told DeAndre that the machine was completely bricked, enterprise locked, and radiating stolen energy. He refused to offer a single dime for it and told DeAndre to get the massive paperweight out of his store before he triggered a silent alarm. DeAndre was furious. He argued with the man, slamming his fist on the counter, demanding at least a few $100s for the monitors. The broker simply reached under the counter and pulled out a heavy wooden baseball bat, resting it casually on top of the glass. DeAndre swallowed his pride, grabbed the heavy server tower, and dragged it back out to his truck. He tossed the equipment back into the truck bed, completely defeated. He had driven 30 miles, wasted his remaining gasoline, and humiliated himself for absolutely nothing. He climbed back into his truck and started the long, silent drive back to Fairfield. Meanwhile, I remained on the phone with the commercial crimes detective. I watched the blue dot leave the pawn shop and begin heading north. I relayed this information to the detective. I told him that the suspect was currently transporting the stolen assets back toward my primary residence. I explicitly told the police not to intercept him on the highway. I wanted the charges consolidated. I explained that my attorney was currently drafting an emergency order of protection and an illegal detainer for the suspect at that exact residence. I emailed the detective the real-time GPS tracking logs, the digital ownership certificates, and the serial number registry for the hardware. The detective assured me that this evidence was more than enough to secure a felony arrest warrant for grand larceny and possession of stolen property. He promised to coordinate directly with the county sheriff's department to ensure the warrant was attached to the morning eviction papers. When DeAndre finally pulled his truck back into the Fairfield driveway, the sun was beginning to set. He carried my heavy workstation back into the garage and dumped it on the floor, entirely unaware that the machine he had just tried to sell was actively transmitting his location to a police database. He walked back into the sweltering house to face his angry wife and his panicked mother-in-law empty-handed. A few hours later, he would destroy the HVAC system. A few hours after that, the smart locks would engage, sealing him inside. And then he would desperately break into my safe, cementing his fate. Every single arrogant move he made was perfectly documented. Every attempt to steal my resources only tightened the legal noose around his neck. He thought he was playing a game of street smarts against a naive computer nerd. He never realized he had stepped onto a chessboard where I controlled every single piece. I closed the tracking software on my laptop and took a deep breath. The digital net was fully woven. I had successfully transformed their petty family cruelty into a series of highly documented criminal offenses. They had mistaken my previous financial generosity for weakness. They assumed my silence was a sign of submission. But true power does not need to scream or throw luggage onto a lawn. True power sits quietly in a hotel room sipping ice water while the people who betrayed you methodically dismantle their own lives. This string of calculated, undeniable felonies was exactly why the sheriff's deputies treated the morning eviction like a tactical raid. It was why DeAndre was not just told to leave the property, but was forcefully handcuffed and shoved into the back of a police cruiser. The pawnshop excursion was the final nail in the coffin, proving that he was not just a disgruntled family member, but an active threat to my assets. As I stood in the driveway watching the taillights of the police cruiser disappear down the suburban street, taking DeAndre to the county lockup, I felt the morning sun warming my face. The heavy, suffocating presence of my toxic family was finally gone. They had demanded that I leave the house because I was a parasite draining their resources. But the reality was now recorded in legal documents, court orders, and police reports. The host had finally recognized the infection, and the extraction was a complete success. The red taillights of the sheriff's cruiser faded around the corner at the end of the manicured street, taking DeAndre to a concrete cell where his entitlement would hold absolutely no currency. The heavy silence that followed was broken only by the static crackle of the remaining deputy's shoulder radio and the distant sound of lawnmowers. The morning sun was fully up now, casting a bright, unforgiving light on the reality of the situation. My mother stood on this pristine concrete of the driveway, holding her single overnight bag. The initial shock that had frozen her vocal cords during the raid was beginning to wear off, replaced by the familiar toxic heat of her ego. She looked around and noticed that several of her wealthy country club neighbors had stepped out onto their front porches, drawn by the flashing blue lights and the shouting. The pristine image she had spent decades cultivating was shattering in real time, and she needed a scapegoat. She turned her sights back to me, her face twisted into a mask of pure righteous indignation. She dropped her bag and pointed a shaking finger at my chest. Her voice echoed down the quiet suburban street, loud enough for every nosy neighbor to hear. She screamed that I was a monster. She yelled that I was evicting my own mother, throwing my own flesh and blood out onto the street like stray dogs. She cried out, asking how a daughter could be so cruel and heartless to the woman who gave her life. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime, trying to weaponize the audience of neighbors and the remaining police officers to shame me into backing down. Keisha stood slightly behind her, holding the children, nodding along, and sobbing loudly, playing her role perfectly. They thought public pressure would break me. They thought I would shrink under the judgmental stares of the neighborhood. I did not shrink. I stood taller. I calmly walked over to Valerie's SUV and retrieved my digital tablet from the front seat. I walked back toward my mother, stopping just a few feet away. The two remaining sheriff's deputies watched the exchange closely, their hands resting casually on their duty belts, ready to intervene if things turned physical. I held up the tablet and turned the brightness all the way up. I spoke in a voice that was calm, clear, and loud enough to carry just as far as her screaming had. I said, I am not evicting my mother. I am evicting a squatter who invited a violent felon into my home. Elaine scoffed and opened her mouth to argue, but I pressed play on the video file. I had queued up the highest resolution clip from the hidden office camera. The audio was crystal clear. DeAndre's grunts echoed from the tablet speakers as he violently swung the heavy steel crowbar against my custom mahogany walls. The deputies immediately leaned in, recognizing the suspect they had just arrested. I let the video play as DeAndre shattered the drywall, ripped the biometric safe from its housing, and tore through my private legal documents. I looked at my mother and asked if she knew what he was looking for. I asked if she knew that while she was sitting in the dark, sweating and complaining, her golden son-in-law was destroying thousands of dollars of my property, trying to steal my financial assets. Elaine stammered, looking away from the screen. She said DeAndre was just stressed and that I drove him to it by locking the doors. She said a broken door did not justify throwing a grandmother out onto the street. I smiled a cold, humorless smile. I swiped the screen to the next piece of evidence. I pulled up the official police report and the pawn shop security stills that the commercial crimes detective had emailed me. I shoved the screen closer to her face. I told her that DeAndre was not just stressed. I explained that hours before the lockdown, he had stolen $10,000 of enterprise server equipment from my garage and tried to fence it at a shady pawn shop in the next town over. I told her he failed because the equipment was corporate locked and actively tracking him via GPS. The remaining color drained completely from Elaine's face. The neighbors watching from their lawns began to murmur among themselves. The narrative of the cruel daughter was dead, replaced by the undeniable reality of a criminal family. But I was not finished. The physical eviction was complete, but the emotional reckoning was just beginning. I handed the tablet back to Valerie and unzipped the leather portfolio I had brought from the lawyer's office. It was the same portfolio DeAndre had discarded on the floor of my office. I looked at my mother and told her that DeAndre missed the most important document in the safe because he was too stupid to understand what he was looking at. I pulled out a thick, bound packet of papers featuring a bright blue legal seal. I said, "You called me a parasite, Elaine. You told me my life was too easy and that I did not understand family. But you do not know the first thing about my life." I opened the packet and read the title aloud. It was the formation document for the Ruby Star Retirement Trust. I explained that for the past 2 years, I had been quietly siphoning a large portion of my annual bonuses into this specific trust. I knew her 60th birthday was coming up in a few months. I also knew a secret she had been hiding from Keisha, from the family, and from her wealthy friends. I looked her dead in the eyes and mentioned the $85,000 in high-interest medical debt she had accumulated from her cosmetic procedures and private wellness retreats. Debt she had illegally acquired by opening credit lines using the Fairfield house as collateral before I bought the mortgage. Elaine gasped, taking a step back as if I had physically struck her. She looked around frantically, terrified that her country club friends had heard me expose her deep financial shame. I continued, speaking, my voice unwavering. I told her the trust was fully funded. The plan was to completely wipe out her $85,000 medical debt on the morning of her birthday. But that was not all. I flipped to the second page of the document, showing a fully executed purchase agreement for a luxury 2-bedroom oceanfront condominium in Boca Raton, Florida. It was a gated community with a private golf course, exactly the kind of place she had always dreamed of retiring to. I told her the condo was paid for in cash. The deed was ready to be transferred into her name, free and clear. I had planned to give her the keys, hand her a life free of debt, and let her live out her days in absolute luxury, while I kept the Fairfield house as my primary residence. I had built an entire kingdom for her, because despite everything, I still wanted my mother to have a beautiful life. The silence on the driveway was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping. Keisha stood frozen, staring at me with her mouth slightly open. I looked down at the documents and then back at my mother. I said, all you had to do was nothing. All you had to do was continue living rent-free in my house for 3 more months. But you could not do it. You could not stand the fact that I was successful and you were not. So you threw my luggage onto the grass. You called me a parasite and you told me to leave. You chose to back a son-in-law who destroys everything over a daughter who was literally buying your freedom. I took the retirement trust documents and slowly, deliberately ripped them right down the middle. The sound of the thick, tearing paper echoed like a gunshot. I tore them again and let the pieces flutter to the concrete driveway, landing right at her feet. I said the parasite comment ended the dream, Elaine. The condo in Boca Raton goes back on the market tomorrow morning. The trust is being dissolved, and the funds are being redirected to my personal investment portfolio. You get absolutely nothing. You are walking away from this property today with exactly what you brought into my life. Nothing but a bad attitude and an empty bank account. Keisha suddenly snapped out of her shock. She turned on our mother with a level of ferocity I had never seen from her before. Keisha screamed at her, asking if it was true. She yelled, "You threw away a free luxury condo. You threw away our only financial support because you wanted to play favorites and act tough on the front porch." Keisha shoved her mother's shoulder, demanding to know how they were supposed to survive now. Elaine did not fight back. She did not yell. The grand matriarch broke completely. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the hard concrete of the driveway, sobbing hysterically. She reached out, trying to grab the torn pieces of the trust document, but they were just useless scraps of paper now. She realized the magnitude of her colossal, unforced error. She had burned down a winning lottery ticket because she did not like the person who handed it to her. The lead deputy cleared his throat, stepping forward to end the spectacle. He told Elaine and Keisha that it was time to leave the premises immediately. He warned them that if they returned, they would be arrested for criminal trespassing. Keisha scrambled to pull her phone from her pocket, using the last percentage of her battery to order a car service. They stood at the edge of the driveway, waiting in agonizing, humiliating silence, while the neighbors openly stared and whispered. 10 minutes later, a standard sedan pulled up. Keisha loaded her crying children into the back seat. Elaine slowly picked up her single overnight bag and climbed in next to them without looking back at the house or at me. The car pulled away, driving slowly down the street and turning the corner permanently, removing the infection from my life. Valerie stepped up beside me, putting a warm hand on my shoulder. She smiled and said that was the most thorough, legal, and emotional dismantling she had ever witnessed in her entire career. I thanked her and handed her the torn documents, asking her to officially liquidate the secondary trust. I turned around and looked at the Fairfield house. The steel security shutters were still drawn tight, and the front door hung slightly off its hinges, but it was finally mine. The ghosts of my childhood, the toxic expectations, and the crushing weight of their entitlement were gone. I took a deep breath of the fresh morning air, feeling truly awake for the first time in my life. I walked up the porch steps, ready to unlock the doors, open the windows, and let the light back into my home. I stepped over the threshold, and the wave of stale, humid air hit me immediately. The smell of melted wiring, burnt plastic, and lingering desperation hung thick in the hallway. I did not dwell on the mess. I walked straight to the basement, unlocked the utility door, and flipped the main manual override breakers. The heavy steel shutters slowly rolled up with a mechanical hum. Bright morning sunlight flooded the living room, illuminating the broken candles, the scattered cereal, and the shattered drywall. I opened every single window, letting the fresh Connecticut breeze sweep the toxicity out of my home. The physical cleanup was going to take some time, but the emotional air was already crystal clear. I hired a professional cleaning crew and an emergency contractor that very afternoon. While they repaired the oak door, replaced the drywall, and installed a brand new climate control system, I kept tabs on my family's rapid descent through updates from Valerie. DeAndre was arraigned on multiple felony charges, including grand larceny and malicious destruction of property. Because he had a prior record and was considered a flight risk, the judge set his bail at a staggering $50,000. With no assets and no one willing to put up collateral, DeAndre was sent directly to county lockup to await trial. The man who thought he could bully his way into my fortune was now wearing an orange jumpsuit and sleeping on a thin mattress. But the most poetic justice was reserved for Elaine and Keisha. When they left my driveway in that sedan, they assumed they could simply fall back on Elaine's extensive network of wealthy friends. Elaine directed the driver to take them to the sprawling estate of her closest country club confidant. But suburban gossip moves faster than a speeding car. By the time they arrived, the entire neighborhood knew about the police raid, the arrest, and the eviction. Elaine's friend refused to even open the front gates. She spoke to my mother through the intercom, telling her that she could not associate with someone involved in a felony police investigation. Elaine desperately started calling distant relatives. She called cousins and aunts, playing the victim and begging for a place to stay. But my extended family knew exactly how Elaine and Keisha operated. They knew about Keisha's explosive temper and Elaine's demanding nature. One by one, every single door was slammed in their faces. Nobody wanted to invite a financially ruined, demanding matriarch and her entitled daughter into their homes. By nightfall, their options were completely exhausted. The driver of the car service demanded his payment, but Keisha's credit cards were maxed out, and Elaine's accounts were permanently frozen. The driver eventually kicked them out on a commercial street corner. With nowhere else to turn, the grand matriarch of the family and her golden child were forced to walk to a municipal family shelter on the outskirts of the city. Valerie later told me that Elaine had tried to demand a private room at the shelter, citing her medical conditions and her social status. The intake worker simply handed her 2 thin blankets and pointed her toward a gymnasium filled with dozens of other displaced families. The woman who used to turn her nose up at anything less than imported sparkling water was now sleeping on a metal folding cot surrounded by strangers. Keisha, who had always relied on everyone else to solve her problems, spent her first night in the shelter, sobbing uncontrollably, finally forced to face the harsh reality of her own uselessness. Meanwhile, my life was moving forward with incredible speed. The contractors finished repairing my office and the HVAC system in less than a week. The house looked pristine, but walking through the empty halls, I realized I had no desire to stay there. The colonial house was a monument to my past, a symbol of the heavy burdens I had carried for far too long. I called a high-end real estate agent and listed the property the next morning. The Fairfield housing market was incredibly competitive. Because the home was heavily upgraded with state-of-the-art security and brand-new climate systems, we received multiple offers within 48 hours. A bidding war broke out between 2 wealthy corporate executives moving out from the city. 30 days later, I sat in a sleek conference room and signed the final closing documents. The house sold for significantly above the asking price. After paying off the closing costs and the legal fees, I walked away with a pure unencumbered profit of $300,000. I packed my designer luggage, the exact same bags my mother had thrown onto the lawn, and caught a first-class flight heading south. I transferred my position to our corporate hub in Charlotte, North Carolina. I wanted a fresh start in a place where nobody knew my history. I purchased a stunning modern penthouse apartment overlooking the vibrant city skyline. There are no guest rooms in my new home. There is no space for anyone who does not bring peace into my life. 2 months after the eviction, I was sitting on my private balcony sipping a glass of expensive red wine and watching the sunset over Charlotte. My phone buzzed on the glass table. It was an incoming call from an unknown local Connecticut number. I normally ignored unknown calls, but a profound sense of intuition told me to answer. I pressed the green button and held the phone to my ear. "Charmaine, please do not hang up." It was my mother. Her voice was unrecognizable. The arrogant country club tone was completely gone, replaced by a raspy, broken whisper. She was crying heavily, gasping for air between her words. "Charmaine, we are still in the shelter. It is horrible here. Keisha is severely depressed, and the kids are constantly sick. DeAndre took a plea deal and is going to prison for 2 years. We have absolutely nothing left. I am so sorry for everything I said to you. I was wrong. You were always the strong one. Please, I am begging you. Just let us come back to the house. We will live in the basement. We will do whatever you want. Please just save us." I listened to her desperate pleas, feeling the cool evening breeze against my skin. I felt no guilt. I felt no obligation. The emotional cord had been completely severed. I took a slow sip of my wine, tasting the rich, complex notes. My voice was perfectly calm, steady, and absolutely devoid of emotion. "The house is sold, Mom. You should have been more careful about who you called a parasite. Parasites don't pay the mortgage, owners do." I ended the call and permanently blocked the number. I set my phone down on the table and looked out at the beautiful, glowing city lights. My life was finally completely and entirely my own. Thank you so much for following my story. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic family to protect your own peace, I want you to know that you are not alone. It takes incredible strength to close a door on the people you love, but sometimes it is the only way to save yourself. Please share your own experiences in the comments below. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about setting boundaries and taking back your power. Until next time, remember that your peace is your most valuable asset, and you should never let anyone bankrupt your soul.